Good evening. My name is Vincent Wang. I'm a faculty member of the Department of Political Science. Tonight, we are very honored to have a very special guest among us, and I will tell you a little bit about his distinguished records in both public service and academics. For students of international politics and American foreign policy, our guest tonight, Dr. Anthony Lake, exemplified the finest tradition of bridging theory and practice, academia and government. For ordinary Americans, particularly the young people, many of them in the audience today, he also inspires dedication and public service to the country. I think this is an element that we can all hope to have more of. Since his first post as a young foreign service officer in the State Department in 1962, Dr. Lake has accumulated a very long and distinguished record of public service in the past 39 years. His service, of course, culminated in his service as the National Security Advisor in the first Clinton administration from 1993 to 1997. To give you an idea of the importance of a National Security Advisor to the President, the National Security Advisor is usually the first person the President will see on any given day. He is also the last person the President will see on any given day. Further, he is the last person the President will see before the President sees any foreign guest. So he has access to the President, and he's the top foreign policy advisor to President Clinton. But more importantly, in many ways, the administration he had served, namely the first Clinton administration, was really the first US administration that articulated a new and comprehensive vision for the post-Cold War era. Dr. Lake is widely considered an important intellectual brainchild for the so-called Clinton doctrine, the notion of democratic enlargement and the concept of economic cooperation as a substitute to traditional military competition. As President Clinton's top foreign policy advisor, he helped deal with many foreign policy crises. For example, the former Yugoslavia, Haiti, Somalia, Rwanda, and the Taiwan Strait, and defined a new world order. But of course, this was by no means his only public service. In fact, he had held many important positions in the State Department, including the post in Vietnam, the State Department Policy Planning Staff, and the National Security Council. In 1976, he was part of the Carter transition team with expertise on foreign and defense policies. On the academic side, Dr. Lake is equally distinguished. He has been a distinguished professor in the practice of diplomacy at Georgetown University since 1997. He was the Five College Professor in International Relations at Mount Holyoke College from 1981 to 1992. He has published 4 books. The latest one is entitled Six Nightmares, published November in 2000, which he will probably talk a little bit about the new challenges facing the United States. He is also currently the principal of IntelliBridge, an internet firm. Dr. Lake received his PhD and MPA from the prestigious Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs of Princeton University. His dissertation, interestingly enough, was about US policy toward South Africa. He studied at Cambridge University and received his BA from Harvard. He also graduated from Middlesex School. I heard a very interesting story during dinner why he graduated there. But more interestingly to me is that he said while studying at Cambridge, he was trying to teach himself Mandarin Chinese. So he listened to a record and he said, who are you? 你是谁? And then he said, I am I, 我是我. And he said, and what's your name? My name is Wang Er, 1 second. So he has been looking for that Mr. Wang to knock on his door. I'm very delighted that I'm that Mr. Wang that brings Dr. Lake to the University of Richmond. Now, a little bit about logistics. Dr. Lake is going to talk with us for about 30 or 35 minutes. After that, we will have a question and answer session, and then we will have a reception following. So I hope you will have a chance to interact with this very personable man. Without further ado, we are very delighted and honored to have this important guest to be with us tonight and to share with us his insights on America's changing roles in the new century. Dr. Lake.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. When you were saying that I was the first person, which is true, that the president would see in the morning, and he was not a morning person, so that was not always a perfect experience. And I was the last person and I thought what you were going to say was that since I worked on all those issues like Bosnia and Somalia, et cetera, the truth is I was the last person he wanted to see at any point during the day. I'm really glad to be here. I'm from New England, and we don't do flattery in New England, but I've got to say this is the most beautiful campus I've ever been on, and the dinner was wonderful, and thank you for your hospitality. It really is great. I should also tell you that what I want to talk about are some grim and even scary things, and so you could think that I'm very pessimistic about all of this, and in fact I'm not. I'm not, first of all, because I think we always muddle through things like the things I'll be talking about, and secondly, I'm not because I'm a Red Sox fan. And if you're a Red Sox fan, you have to be an optimist. You know what I'm talking about, and Nomar's gone now for probably 3 months, but still. Maybe it's better that they break our hearts early rather than late this year. Anyway. I will talk about some of the things in my book, and I do so in the confidence that none of you have read it, and therefore you won't be too bored. And I'm not here to suggest that you actually read it, and I'm certainly not suggesting that you buy it. That's not what this evening's about. Although it has this beautiful red cover, and on a coffee table, if you have a nice wooden coffee table, looks pretty good. But anyway. What I want to talk about is, or try to convince you of, is of a somewhat different way of looking at the world. Not a modest proposition, but I think a real one. I won't go at length, in fact I won't go at all, into what is so-called globalization. I'm sure you've all been studying that, reading about it. You're living it every day. Shrinking world, trillions of dollars, or over $1 trillion whipping around the world every day, one global stock market now in effect, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What I do want to suggest to you is that the implication of that is that in this very new world, we have to think about the world in new ways, and even, I believe, have to define our national security in a new way. I suspect that, well, maybe not at a great place like this, but I know at other places I've been and am now, much of the teaching of national security is in the terms of the national security of a nation. And in an era in which there are borders mean less and less, I think that is not how you can define it. You need to define national security in the terms of the security of the citizens of that nation, including our own, in their everyday lives. That's what's real. There aren't any, in a real sense, any more kind of markers on a game board that allow you to have a unitary national security as one thing. And if you look at national security in terms of the security of all of our lives in this room, then you begin to see, I think, the world in a slightly different way. For example, what are the real threats today to our lives, the real ones that are affecting our lives today? They tend to be things like drugs, like transnational crime that is pushing the drugs in, et cetera, et cetera. And just take drugs. From a period of 1988 until 1992, more Americans went into hospitals, emergency rooms with drug-related problems than the casualties we suffered during all of World War II. My point being that if some foreign government were doing to us what this phenomenon that is so easily takes place, drugs in an era of globalization, as our borders become more and more eroded, if some foreign enemy government were doing that to us, we would be going to war. Next point, and this is my main point, the text that I want to argue with you some, is that all of us in the national security racket, certainly me, when we were trained and in how we speak about it, we were trained to deal with threats to our national security that flow from other nations' strengths, others' missiles, others' armies, others' wily diplomats, etc. But I believe that, in fact, what is creating more threats to the United States today and are more dangerous to us are other nations' weaknesses, not strengths. And that's what I want to talk to you about a little bit and explain what I mean. I think the point's obvious when you talk about economics, and I won't belabor the point, but if you think, for example, of our headlines in all our newspapers for the last few weeks, most of them on the front page have been about national missile defense, other nations' missiles, about Macedonia, about, well, a whole series of things, all about other nations' strengths. And buried somewhere in the business page or somewhere else tends to be the stories about Japan's political weaknesses and the weaknesses of Japan's economy. But in terms of your lives, what happens in the Japanese economy is going to have far more impact than what happens in Macedonia. Certainly we have competitive relations with other nations and their economic strengths can be a threat to us, but it is their weaknesses, the danger of a new collapse in Asia, a danger of an economic continued stagnation, if nothing else in Japan, a danger of Brazil or Mexico's economy going south that is much more threatening to us. It would have more real impact on your lives. It's their weaknesses that are threatening to us. But the point extends beyond that. The issue that takes, the foreign policy issue, national security issue, that takes probably more time than any other of our presidents over the last 10 years is the problem of so-called fractured states. This was the root of the problem in the Balkans, where Yugoslavia was falling apart. Certainly the root of the problem in these horrible situations in Africa and elsewhere. It produces the arguments that we're having about peacekeeping operations now. All of those are flowing from the weaknesses, obviously, of the states that are fracturing. When the CIA briefer used to come to me every morning to talk about our current problems in the Balkans or elsewhere, I would always learn new provincial capitals, and not under circumstances that I wanted to. And I used to ask the briefer, okay, tell me, what are the provincial capitals I'm going to be learning a year from now? In other words, which new country is going to fall apart? I think all of us are going to know a lot more provincial capitals than are starting to now in two countries, especially Indonesia and Colombia, that are important because each of them have energy resources. Each of them are in important geographic positions. Each of them have internal fractures now that are affecting their neighbors. Our interests are deeply involved. We're going to have to deal with it. And again, all of that is proceeding from weakness. By the way, I'd love to talk more, if you want to, about peacekeeping, because I don't think we have that right in conceptual terms, but there's not time here. Consider also, and this is less obvious perhaps, how weaknesses are producing some of the behavior in other large nations that could well become our adversaries. In other words, how the weaknesses are producing the actions that we interpret as threatening strengths. The point is most obvious when you talk about Russia. The predictions in 1998 that the Russian economy was about to collapse, that there would be hyperinflation, et cetera, when the ruble collapsed, in fact have been wrong. And over the last year, the Russian economy is growing at about a 1.5% a year. And therefore, we can at least want to try to relax a bit. But that, in fact, is, I believe, an illusion, because much of that growth is coming from an increase in energy prices and is not the result of fundamental Russian reforms and how they collect taxes, is not the result of the development of an internal market, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we're going to continue to see a weak economy in Russia. Actually, it's quite extraordinary. The Russian formal economy is about 1.5 times that of Switzerland. This is a real problem. The Russians suffered greatly in the mid and late 1990s, and here the Clinton administration, I think, made some mistakes in supporting the so-called loans for shares program, which allowed the kleptocracy in Russia to steal a lot of money, much of which went then out of Russia. The estimates are that between $50 billion and $250 billion were taken out of Russia in the period just after 1995. And you can get a sense of the scale of that disaster when you recognize that in 1999, the Russian government's budget was only $25 billion. So it was a huge loss. So why does this matter? Why does this weakness matter? Well, it matters because it's producing a lot of the behavior that we so object to now with the Russians. It matters because the Russian military is starved for resources, and therefore there is a debate going on still in Russia about how do they compensate for that. And one of the ways that many in the Russian military are arguing for is to rely more on nuclear weapons because they are less expensive than conventional weapons. And that they're not even debating whether to keep the tactical nuclear weapons that could be so dangerous in a future crisis. But what should make your palms sweat is that because they can't afford to keep them up, the Russian radar systems are starting to be degraded, and that means that they can't see our missiles as well as they could before, and that means that they have to put, presumably, their nuclear forces on a greater hair trigger than they had before. And that, as I said, should make your palms sweat, because I genuinely believe that the chances of a nuclear accident in exchange with the Russians is higher now than it was during the Cold War. And I would bet none of you think about nuclear weapons the way, or worry about them the way my generation did when we were your age. It also means that the Russians cannot afford to have the proper safeguards on their nuclear materials. Not only do they have about 12,000 nuclear warheads, but they have enough nuclear materials to build 70,000, that's 70,000 nuclear weapons, and if only a little, and they're under very, very poor controls, and if only a tiny percentage of that leaks out to beyond Russia's borders into the hands of those who want to build nuclear weapons and who shouldn't be, we got a real problem. So that's dangerous. And the sense of grievance in Russia about having lost the Cold War and about their economic programs is producing a psychology of kind of a look-at-me diplomacy. The way I can be involved is to oppose the United States, make trouble, reach out for economic as well as political reasons to Iran, et cetera, and this is all dangerous. You may think this is juvenile, but imagine for a moment if we had lost the Cold War, what the psychosis would be in Washington. So all of this is proceeding from Russian weakness. The point is, and I think that's fairly almost unarguable, a less obvious example is China, where I believe that much of what we're seeing in Chinese behavior is flowing, again, not from Chinese strengths, as many of those who argue that the dragon is about to devour Taiwan or spread its fiery breath all over Southeast Asia or really even to our shores. In fact, I think some of the dangers in Chinese behavior and where we're going flow from Chinese weakness. Again, economic. The problem is this. The Chinese claim that their economy is growing at about 8.5% a year. That's probably wrong. Most analysts agree that it's considerably less than that. First of all, they're probably overstating it on principle, as governments do. And secondly, much of it is goods that are being manufactured and then put into warehouses because they can't sell them, but that still counts in the growth. So they got less than that. And here's their problem. They have to carry out the economic reforms that Zhu Rongji is saying that they has been fighting for because they know that they can't compete in the global marketplace unless they do it. They got to do it because their state-run enterprises are inefficient. They got to do it because their banking sector is in big trouble. They got to do it because when they join the WTO, they will have obligations to do it. They got to carry out the economic reforms. Those reforms, in turn, create unemployment. 10 million or so already in the state-run enterprises, and those unemployed are joining probably 100 million or more who are coming to the cities from rural areas, wandering around, etc. It is helping to create labor unrest, especially in the western part of China, etc. So they got to do the reforms. It's going to create the unemployment, and that in turn means social unrest and political unrest. And while we in the United States don't like social and political unrest, in China they hate it for centuries-old reasons. The central principle in Chinese governance over many centuries has been holding together China, the unity of China. This is why they feel so intensely about Taiwan, for example, never mind that they've only ruled Taiwan for, 7 years out of the last 100. It's a deeply emotional issue. And it is an emotional issue because I found when I was in Beijing, beginning the so-called strategic dialogue in 1996, that the weight of history was very strong on them when you would talk to them about it, in remembering the unequal treaties, the concessions that were forced on China by the Western powers in the late 19th century. So they have a historic sense of weakness, and they have these massive economic problems flowing from the reforms that are creating these political difficulties. So how do you deal with the political unrest? And you have a number of options. If we all pretend for a moment that we were Chinese leaders, one of them is to create a social safety net. That means you can take care of people so that they won't be moving into opposition. And that is impossible because they don't have the money to do it, and the money that they do have, they're putting into, yes, military spending and other things. So how else do you do it? Well, I think that the other way you can deal with the unrest resulting from the necessary economic reforms is twofold. One, you can make ideological appeals. The problem here is that communism as an ideology in China is a spent force. This is why Falun Gong was so upsetting to them, because they know that the ideological approach won't work in their traditional Marxist terms. Therefore, you substitute nationalism. And we have seen repeatedly now, including dangerously over Taiwan, the recourse to nationalism as a unifying force in China. And secondly, you deal with the dissent simply by repressing it, as we are seeing increasingly in the growing human rights abuses over the past few years. So I would argue that because of their economic weaknesses that require the reforms and then they're unable to deal with them in building a social safety net, the Chinese government, the government in Beijing, is compensating in ways that appear to us to be manifestations of strength, i.e. threatening sounds about Taiwan, nationalist appeals, or human rights repression, that is very dangerous because it plays right into our own debates about China, where we are seeing increasingly on the right in the United States a proclamation that China is our inevitable enemy because of their nationalistic statements. And on the left in the United States, proclamations that China is our enemy because of the human rights abuses. And this is squeezing the middle of what I believe is a sensible policy towards China, which is engagement, disagreeing with them, speaking out when we disagree with them, but working with them where we do agree and treating them with the respect that a great nation deserves. And if our debates on the left and the right come together in a way that proclaims China as our enemy, certainly China will be confirmed in its growing view that we are their enemy, and the strategic consequences for our policies in the Pacific, our defense budgets, the economies of Asia, et cetera, could be profound. Another example, North Korea. And I won't go on and on about this, but the danger in North Korea, obviously, to me, is not the strengths, dangerous as they are, and they are indeed very dangerous, the missile developments, the fact that over the last 6 months, in fact, they are sending more troops to their border with South Korea, not less, et cetera. That's all dangerous stuff. But again, what it is reflecting is a growing sense of desperation in North Korea about the state of their economy, so that I think one of the reasons why they're developing their missiles is both as a way of blackmailing us into economic aid because of their economic weaknesses, and as a way perhaps of selling the missiles to others. But in strategic terms, the great danger in North Korea will come when it collapses, and it will collapse. That system just doesn't work. And it can either collapse in dramatic ways, for example, through a civil war and anarchy, a kind of an Albania writ large, which would create huge numbers of refugees spilling across the 38th parallel or into China, et cetera, and create some very, very difficult decisions for us on how to deal with it. Or it can collapse in a so-called soft landing over a little more time and in a little less dramatic way. It is, I believe, very important that while we maintain our deterrence, and in 1994 we came closer to a war on the Korean Peninsula than we ever did in any other area of the world in the 1990s, or since 1991, while we have to maintain our deterrence, while we have to be very firm with the North Koreans, at the same time, to me, it is close to lunacy. Well, I'm a little strong. I'm from New England and I don't say things like that. But anyway, not to be supporting the kinds of policies that Kim Dae-jung has in South Korea, not because we're going to turn Kim Jong-il in the North into Thomas Jefferson, but because in the long run, the better off the North Korean economy is while it collapses, then one, the lesser the chance that there will be a dramatic catastrophic collapse that could be very, very dangerous on the peninsula. And secondly, when it collapses, there is then going to be not just an opportunity, but probably an inevitability of some form of reunification. Reunification in Korea is going to be far more expensive than reunification ever was in Germany. And by definition, the better off the North Korean economy is, the less the expense to South Korea, and I would add South Korea's friends, in dealing with the unification that the people on both sides of the border are going to call for. So we have a strategic interest, I think, in dealing again with the weaknesses in North Korea. Beyond the weaknesses that create failed states, economic dangers, threatening behavior by other large nations, North Korea, et cetera, I think that the fact is, and I'll talk about this just, 10 minutes? Yeah, okay. Create a situation in which, and again, I don't want to scare you, but I do want to alarm you, in which I think there is a growing possibility of a catastrophic attack using weapons of mass destruction in the United States over the next 10 to 20 years. Now, am I saying it's going to happen? No, I'm not at all. But it is the result of weaknesses. Why? Well, for three reasons. First of all, and why is this increasingly likely? First of all, it's because a perceived sense of weakness, in a way, is making the use of a weapon of mass destruction more and more attractive to folks who might attack. I'll come back to all of these. The second is that while it is extremely difficult to construct a weapon of mass destruction, a nuclear weapon, biological weapon, chemical weapon, it is not impossible, and it is getting easier because of various weaknesses in the international system or international realities. And third, because our preparations for either deterring, preventing, or dealing with such an attack while better than they were 5 years ago, remain, yes, weak. All of this flows, not to belabor the point, from, again, globalization and the erosion of borders in very practical ways, the erosion of the capacity of governments to deal with non-governmental international forces like terrorism, transnational criminal groups, et cetera, et cetera. And again, because of the sense of weakness and grievance by those who might use them. Let me just take a moment to tell you what I'm talking about here. I mean, on the weapons. I can't possibly tell you what I'm really talking about if I'm just babbling anyway, if you see what I mean. But anyway, on the weapons. The easiest to make is a chemical weapon, although it's still quite dangerous to its makers to make one, and you should not try this at home.
Don't do it.
But they are weapons like sarin or VX, as in the movie, what was it called? The Rock, which is a VX. By the way, a really stupid movie. If you think that, how many of you have seen it? If you think that our government is able to communicate internally the way they did in that movie, it's crazy. We could not at the beginning, I could not at the beginning of the Clinton administration, and I could not at the end of the first term, and I suspect it's still not very good, get our communications people to devise a system in which the cabinet level people dealing on these issues were constantly in touch with each other, much less frogmen going through tunnels into Alcatraz. Wait a minute, that's an aside. They are extremely lethal, chemical weapons, but very limited in the space in which people would die. The hardest to make, and obviously the biggest bang, are nuclear weapons. But nonetheless, there's a growing danger of it, not just because of the leakage of fissile materials potential from Russia or elsewhere, but because of the leakage of experts. By the way, I read that the Congress is cutting funds in the so-called non-Lugar program that helps the Russians strengthen their controls over these materials, which in here I have no hesitation in saying is truly lunacy. But to, again, make your palms sweat slightly, you wouldn't have to build a nuclear weapon. If you packed a conventional weapon in radioactive materials, which you can get from a hospital or someplace, for example, at the World Trade Center, there had been radioactive materials around the explosive device, the catastrophe would have been far worse. And then you have biological weapons, for example, anthrax. These are very hard to make, especially in the powdered form that you would need to get a good dispersal if the wind was right, preferably at twilight, et cetera, et cetera. Again, don't do this at home. But it is entirely feasible, and these are far more lethal than chemical weapons, and scarier in the sense that if there were anthrax coming into the vents here, none of us would know it for 2 days before we began to develop the symptoms, and then most of us would die. And not just that, but it's not just the anthraxes, but smallpox. I have, and I hadn't realized it was 39 years, and I do appreciate you telling me that I'd been in the racket for 39 years. Actually, I'm considering the alternatives, glad to be here. But I have been, how many of you have been inoculated against smallpox? Well, sort of a self-defining group, not very many. All of you unpardonably young people have not been. And we don't have large supplies of a smallpox vaccine, and that means that if somebody were to reintroduce smallpox into our population, we would have a plague like nothing we've ever seen before. Or you can create hybrids of Ebola and smallpox, et cetera. So this is, again, serious stuff. And then finally, let me mention what most don't as a weapon of mass destruction, and that is a truly fearsome weapon called the computer. We tend to think of cyber attacks as a reverse neutron bomb. The neutron bomb, as you'll recall, was later called the enhanced radiation weapon because it got a bad name. and for a good reason. A neutron bomb killed people but not things. And we tend to think of cyber attacks as going after things, critical infrastructures, et cetera, and not people, and that is quite wrong. Cyber attacks could have a devastating human effect on hospitals, on air traffic controllers, on 911 systems, et cetera, et cetera. And I will not give you specific examples because this you could do at home. There are, well, in fact, my view of humanity has changed as I thought about this somewhat. The fact is that very, very few people could develop a chemical or biological weapon, but the pool of potential terrorists using computers is extremely large. And in fact, anytime I see a pale-looking person with a backwards baseball cap, obviously spending all his or her time in the basement rather than outside playing baseball or something, I think to myself, computer, potential terrorists. And to reverse what was the saying when I was your age, there you go, thank you. To reverse the saying that I remember from when I was your age, I don't trust anybody under 30 now. But anyway, you'll remember what I was talking about. In any case, the pool is very large. There are 5,000 targets or more that the government has identified that are critical to not just things, but human welfare in our society. And the number of attacks, not by terrorists, but by criminals on computers, which is a huge tax on American businesses now, seldom reported because it would hurt confidence in our banks, et cetera. But FBI estimates that only about 15% or so of attacks are ever reported to the FBI. But that said, the FBI now has under investigation, I think, about 1,500 current cases of computer attacks around the country, so there's a real problem. So why is this quite possible? Well, first of all, weapons of mass destruction are attractive to the new breed of terrorists. 10, 20 years ago, most terrorists had a very clear political agenda. They took responsibility for their actions. They were proud to do it because they were political acts, et cetera, et cetera. This made them somewhat easy to track and even to deter. Today's terrorists, what I call existential terrorists, have less of a political agenda and more simply want to lash out, get revenge against a society or foreign societies or a government in the United States like Timothy McVeigh or whatever. They simply want revenge. They want to lash out because of their own perceived weakness, failures, et cetera. The Unabomber, Theodore Kaczynski, wrote in his diary very explicitly, what I want is revenge. By the way, Theodore Kaczynski was graduated from college a year after me. I don't remember him. More importantly, he doesn't remember me.
But that's because you're not teaching in natural sciences.
Yeah, yes, thank God, yes. For people like that, especially biological weapons, I think would be very attractive because of their anonymity, et cetera. Second group that might be increasingly attracted to such weapons are foreign governments. In Washington, the cliche is so-called asymmetrical warfare, in which, because others know they can't stand up to our overwhelming military force, they would increasingly have recourse to terrorism, guerrilla warfare, et cetera, et cetera. In the book, I suggest that, in fact, the problem is worse than that, and it is what I call ambiguous warfare, in which foreign governments would strike back at us without taking responsibility for their actions, which would make it very hard for us to then respond again if we couldn't prove that they had done it, even if most people assumed that they had. I mean, supposing a terrorist incident here, we figure out who did it, we hit them with tomahawks, as we traditionally do now, they then presumably respond, there's a new terrorist incident in the United States or abroad against an American installation. We can't prove they did it. What does the president do? Does he bomb them again and thus incur the wrath of the whole world and much of the American population? Or does he do nothing, in which case they've won and we've lost? And finally, there is the growing potential of extortion by criminal groups. Access, again, is becoming easier. You can get recipes for chemical weapons on the internet. You can, which by the way raises the issue, should we censor the internet, which I believe we should not. Our borders are becoming more porous. Only about 5% of the containers that come into the United States are ever inspected. Only somewhere, it depends on the border post between, or customs, between 2 and 10%. That means that if you want to send a nuclear weapon into the United States, if you FedEx it, I'm not serious, but if you FedEx it, your chances are 19 out of 20 that it will go through uninspected. That's a lot cheaper than a missile program. And it is why I think if we're spending $100 billion, as it would cost a year or more on NMD, then we ought to be spending some more on how to deal with more sniffers, et cetera, at our borders over what could be a larger, in fact, threat. There's more materials out there for building such weapons. For example, the global trade in chemicals is increasing rapidly, and therefore you have greater access to precursors, et cetera. And in any case, some 27 nations now are known to possess either biological, chemical, or nuclear weapons, and they could leak out. So the possibility of a catastrophic threat or event is growing, and this is not a future threshold. We already saw it in a subway in Tokyo in 1995, where sarin was used, and in a failed effort, which killed only, in quotes, I think 12 people and injured 5,000. What you may not know is that the Aum was trying to develop biological weapons, had tried to test them. One of their scientists had been killed trying to build them, and then they ran out of time and used the chemical weapons instead. So, and our efforts to try to train local police and medical units, et cetera, to deal with this in some 257 cities is embryonic and having problems. So how do we cope with all of this? Not just the terrorism, but a world, I would argue, of weaknesses that is so threatening to us. Well, it's hard. First of all, it's harder to deal with weaknesses than with strengths. There is not a foreign army in the world that we cannot defeat, and defeat quite rapidly, and there is probably not a weak economy in the world that we can fix even over an extended period of time, acting by ourselves. Secondly, it's hard because it's hard to summon the political will to deal, here in the United States, to deal with foreign weaknesses compared with foreign threats. You can give a tub-thumping speech about a military crisis. It's hard to do tub-thumpers about foreign economic crises that may be just as threatening to us. But we got to do it. And what it means is, first of all, and I could go on this and wave my arms, but I won't, you cannot deal with these problems on a unilateral basis. You simply can't, whether it is economic crises abroad, or dealing with international terrorism or international crime, which requires international action. I could go on and on. If the United States moves towards, increasingly towards unilateralism, as we see signs of, we are not going to deal with these threats to the welfare of our citizens. And those who tell you that if we enter into the kinds of agreements that will allow us to deal with these threats, for example, regimes against non-proliferation, et cetera, that we are somehow giving up our sovereignty, those people are fooling you in ways that are intellectually dishonest and dangerous in policy terms. The fact is that we are losing more of our sovereignty every day to the dark side of globalization. And I think globalization on balance is a good thing, but we are losing more of our sovereignty to the kinds of problems I'm talking about than we could ever give up in entering into the regimes aimed at dealing with these problems. And thus those who are apparently most interested in defending our sovereignty as a nation are, I think, contributing more to its erosion than they are to saving it. Secondly, all of this takes resources, obviously, if you're going to bail out a Mexican economy or whatever. And here I have, and then I'll stop, a real concern. I was working, and this occurred to me when I was in the final stages last November and December of working on a treaty between Ethiopia and Eritrea that helped to end their conflict over the past 2 years, a terrible off-camera conflict. And we were talking about then putting together the United Nations peacekeeping force that would go in there. And our Pentagon, after some argument, finally agreed that of a force of some 4,000, we would supply 6 Americans. Now, during the negotiations, they kept looking to me to sort of weigh in with each side and to say, this is the United States speaking, and they would pay attention because I represented the United States. And they took that extremely seriously. But I think we are becoming more and more, I mean, what suddenly occurred to me was this is a bit of a fraud, and I hope they don't figure it out. Because in real terms, we are not walking the walk in the way we talk the talk, or in another sense, we have become a statistical superpower, which gives us a lot of voting rights in the international financial institutions. We're like a poker player with huge quantities of chips in front of us, but we either don't or even dare not put the chips into the middle of the table. So we are, because we are so risk averse, fearful of putting our soldiers on the ground, preferring immaculate coercion from afar where we can. Our embassies, because of a very real, and I understand this threat of terrorism, are increasingly isolated from the societies that they're representing us in. Our aid programs are, on a percentage basis, are at the very bottom of or almost at the very bottom of industrial nations. We are pulling back now in the diplomacy of the Middle East and of the Balkans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think others are starting to figure it out. You can read it about the European reactions to us. You can read it in some of the reactions of some Asian nations. They're beginning to say, well, maybe the United States isn't the player that it ought to be, that the great superpower isn't so super after all. And this is very dangerous because you can't lead if you don't have followers, and you can't lead if you're not going to play. And I think there are some dangerous trends here. So will we do it? Well, if we do it, we have to deal with what I call the 6th nightmare. The first 5 nightmares were about the future. The 6th nightmare is Washington today. I think the problem is that in our politics and in Washington, something we've crossed over, on the edge of crossing over a very dangerous line. And that is, in a democracy, you got to have politics, obviously. But the politics needs to be harnessed to policy. It needs to be about debating important issues. It needs to be about action. And in Washington and in our current politics, politics have become an end in themselves. The whole point is to use the policy not for its own sake, but to use the policy as a device simply to get elected, to shape the policy in the way your political consultants tell you to do it, et cetera, et cetera. And this is, I think, over time leading to a change from what is a very healthy skepticism about our government and our politics. Any democracy needs that skepticism, into a cynicism that is profoundly corrosive of democracy. So, will we overcome all of this? Samuel Goldwyn, great American philosopher, once said that only an idiot would make predictions, especially about the future. Somebody told me actually it was Yogi Berra who said that, but I don't quote Yankees, so I'll stick with Goldwyn. In any case, I would predict that we will overcome it, and I would predict it for the same reason that I began with, and that is that I think the American people will increasingly understand that all of this affects their security in their everyday lives. And that is why we're starting to see more efforts to reform our politics. And that is why I think in the long run, all of us, because our lives are at stake, are going to insist on something better than we are seeing over the past 10 or 20 years and to reverse these trends. And that and my Red Sox illusions are why I remain optimistic, including that there's so many of you here this evening. So thank you. Oh, if I could make one point. It is not questions and answers. It's also comments. And please don't disguise comments as questions. I would much rather hear, "You're an idiot," than, "You're an idiot, aren't you?" Because then, because I have no comment. So please.
Thank you, Dr. Lake, for that very insightful, informative, and gloomy analysis. I think that you have given us a lot of food for thought, a lot of things that we have not seriously thought about before, and perhaps we should. In the interest of time, I think I would just exercise my prerogative of opening to question and answer and comments directly. Matt Walshman has this microphone, the coveted microphone. If you have a question or a comment, you can just proceed to him and he will hand it to you, and please form a line in the middle. First question. Dr. Outland, please.
I think you can probably hear me without the mic. You have prefaced this by saying you're offering us some grim scenarios. I think it's helpful maybe to lend a historical perspective here too. Would you say on balance the world is in worse shape now than say was the case 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago?
Can everybody hear the question?
Use those three general historical markers, perhaps make a comparative assessment.
The truth is I don't think in those terms, even though I wants to be an historian. Because I don't think that's, if I may, the question. I mean, I'll do it. 20 years ago would be what, 1980 or one. Why is it that every year you chose the Rascals are being thrown out and their briefcase being thrown into the Potomac, and the Republicans are coming in? But anyway, compared to 1981, well, you on the most fundamental level, you have to say the world is better off in the sense that there is, in percentage terms, not in real terms, less poverty in the world. That there is more education in the world, that, very importantly, more people live in freedom than ever before now, certainly than in 1981 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we are not living under the same kind of existential threat that we did during the Cold War with the missiles. So sure, it's better off. And I think it's better off than 1961. Come to think of it, that was the other political thing. For essentially the same reasons again. And if you look at our own institutions, and when I'm teaching case studies in American foreign policy that I do, we do the Bay of Pigs. And one of the most striking things is to look at the way American newspapers were covering the government. And while I have many friends who are reporters, but I grew to develop a deep, genuine, and abiding hatred of the press while I was in the White House that was totally undemocratic and wrong, and I was wrong and I shouldn't have had it, but it's the way the game is now. And I think the press goes too far in the opposite direction. But if you look at the way the press behaved in 1961, we're a lot better off now than we were then. I mean, just recall when the U-2 was shot down in 1960, and the president announced that it was a weather reconnaissance flight over the Soviet Union. It was printed straight up by the reporters, and of course it was a bald-faced lie. So I think relatively a more aggressive press is a good thing, although again, maybe not quite in such personal terms sometimes. So I think we were better off, and certainly 41 speaks for itself. But I think the real question is not are we better off than we were then, because we are. The real question is are we better off than we could be now? And there I'm suggesting no, because we're not concentrating. And as I suggest in the book, there are real threats out there. There are needs for reforms in a lot of different areas. And precisely because the Cold War is over, and precisely because this last decade has been a period of such incredible, as it turned out literally incredible, economic good times, that people weren't concentrating, that we could allow ourselves the kind of politics that we've seen, in which we didn't debate fundamental issues. And I use the image that a British Prime Minister used that was quoted by John Kennedy in Why England Slept about the 1930s as England failed to prepare for Hitler. and his actions that those were the years that the locusts ate, which is an image I liked, and I think you can hear the locust munching right now. And we ought to be doing more to prepare.
Any questions? Yes, ma'am. Can you use them?
Can you please use the microphone so that the camera can pick up your question and everyone can hear? Thank you.
You said that China, we should work on engaging more with China. Would you say the same thing with North Korea, or pursuing a more distant relationship with North Korea?
Oh, I think absolutely we should engage with them. We should engage with them, though, in, and please don't understand this in a kind of un-American way. A part of, and this is what makes us a very strong nation and a great nation, but it's also a kind of a diplomatic weakness. We tend to have two categories of foreign nations. There's even more a problem in China. They are either our enemies or our friends. And Germany and Japan went very quickly from being truly evil, wicked people to being wonderful people. If you look at the Life magazine photographs of Joseph Stalin in the 1930s, there was blood dripping from his mustache. During World War II, there was a little twinkle in his eyes, and the mustache comes up a little bit, and then he becomes evil again. He was evil, in fact. But we need to be a little more, and this is deeply in our heritage, going back to the 17th century, 18th century. It's a Manichaean world. We need to be a little more, not too much, but a little more European in all of this, and deal with other nations less as good guys and bad guys, and more in terms of, okay, you got your interests, we've got our interests, we're going to work this through, keep our hands on our wallets, and then try to move them. It may be even because we think that Kim Jong-il is somehow smarter than we are that we dare not deal with him. He ain't. And we are bigger than they are, and I think we can afford to deal with them. We need to find a way to deal with a missile program that doesn't constantly give in to the blackmail that he's using. I think maybe we can do that over time. And we need to support Kim Dae-jung, as I said, in finding ways to build closer ties between North Korea and South Korea, again, with their keeping their hands on their wallets in Seoul, for the, I think, profound strategic reasons that I was suggesting. There is an irony now in the split between Washington and Seoul that we have seen in the last few weeks. And by the way, I think it'll get fixed over time, and that Colin Powell's position will prevail. But the irony is that constantly in the 4 years that we were negotiating, when I was there negotiating with the North Koreans, their overwhelming object was to drive a wedge between us and Seoul. And the irony now is that without the North Koreans having done anything, we have driven the wedge between us and South Korea, and that, I think, is not a good thing, either in terms of our ability to work together and with the Japanese on this incredibly dangerous issue, but also encourages the North Koreans perhaps to think that they can keep driving those wedges, which could ultimately be dangerous.
Okay. Jeremy.
You mentioned North Korea, Indonesia, China, and Russia. So I guess you're saying that like foreign policy is going to have more of a focus towards Asia and that hemisphere. What do you think the future is with regards to foreign policy in Europe? Do you think as EU has more solidarity and stuff, there's going to be less of a dependency on the United States, or do you think the United States needs to stay involved or back away?
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, I failed to mention the Balkans. Well, I think I did, but yeah, I'm in some ways, even if I mentioned Asia more worried about Europe in terms of our overall relationship than I am with Asia. Because if you look at the growing number of trade disputes, if you look at the growing European view that they can go their own way if we're going to go our own way on issues like national missile defense, where we could work out, I think, a common ground there, on the Balkans, et cetera. If we continue to react almost spasmodically every time the Europeans say that they're going to develop more of a defense capacity on their own, whereas I think that we should be saying to them, look, if you want to develop more of a capacity, A, let's work out how you can make sure it's integrated with NATO, which is our policy. And B, and we should really be pounding the Europeans on this, if you're going to do it, don't do it in theoretical sort of French terms where you're restructuring NATO and the arrangements without spending the money on actually developing the capacity, because we could lose both ways if they have developed new doctrines and institutions, but then when push comes to shove somewhere, they can't actually act. And yet we've started pulling back because we believe they can. But I think it is deeply in our interests that Europe become stronger and more capable of action. It was a huge frustration to all of us working on Bosnia that the Europeans simply couldn't get their act together, which meant that we had to take more of a lead than was, I think, almost politically sustainable here often. And I believe, because I've been accused of being one of its most avid supporters, and I stand guilty of this, that NATO enlargement is an extremely important strategic development, and we need to keep the Europeans working on that and pushing that forward also. So, but I am worried that the Europeans are becoming increasingly resentful of us, worried that we're going to be pulling back, and because of philosophical as well as raw economic reasons, increasingly engaged in trade disputes with us that could spill over into our political relationships. So it's a little worrisome.
Okay. Next question. Yes, and then Dr. Taylor.
Comment on the implications for our security of the health crises that are underway in Africa and Russia, and tuberculosis in Russia, as I understand, and as well as HIV is almost as severe as it is in Africa, and perhaps in other parts of the world, Brazil, other parts of the world are experiencing problems. So what do you see as being the, you didn't mention that as being one of the nightmares.
I forgot, yeah. It's not grim enough already? No, this is obviously with the huge increase in air travel and movements of people, the spread, I mean, we see it in hoof and mouth disease in a bovine sense. And in a human sense, there's such a thing, for example, as airport malaria, where malaria is spread by travelers at airports, people getting infected, and the AIDS crisis in the United States is a direct result of an AIDS crisis in Africa. Can I take 2 minutes on a rant that
Sure.
Because this occurred to me the other day, and I'd appreciate it if somebody would tell me I'm wrong. I think that, and we all talk about the revolution in information technology is transforming the world, and of course it's not new. The telephone wires were all a part of that, but it's speeding up, and the internet has huge consequences. You can be a multinational corporation if you have a modem, just any one of you, which was unthinkable. You all think that this is normal. To those of us, did you say 39 years who are that old? It's phenomenal.
Just a number.
But I think even more revolutionary is going to be the bio-revolution, the revolution in genetic engineering, et cetera. And just to name a few consequences, what it's going to mean is, I've had serious people tell me that in another generation or two, the life expectancy for those who can afford it, and that's the point I'll get to, can be 125, 130, that theoretically even people can decide to live almost perpetually one way or another, which was certainly unthinkable psychologically. This means that industrial nations, and it's already happening, are going to have aging populations, which creates all kinds of policy issues that others don't. But what struck me the other day in thinking about the AIDS crisis and the question of the ability of African nations to get generic drugs is that may be the leading edge of what I think will be a truly explosive political and social issue. And that is the following, that if you can use genetic modifications to fix diseases in human beings when they have them, or to fix them in the fetus so that you're turning off the genes that will create Alzheimer's or cancer or whatever, or even as entirely theoretically possible, and probably sooner rather than later, to change the characteristics of people so that they're a little smarter, or so that I'll use ears, and I wish my mother had done something about these, were all plastered against their head in ugly ways like yours all are. That costs money, just as the AIDS drugs cost money. And just think about this. The consequence of that could be that in the industrial nations, they can be, right now the difference between the rich nations and the poor nations is largely, not completely, but largely a question of the quality of life. Now we're going to be talking about life itself. And the resentments, angers, and divisions among the poor nations and the poor within the industrial societies who are not going to have access to these truly miraculous things could be overwhelming. And I'm not just talking about moral issues here, but I'm talking about political, economic, and social consequences as well. The so-called digital divide today about information technology, I think, could be dwarfed by a bio divide in another generation or two that we ought to be thinking about now. Right now, those issues are being debated between the ethicists at divinity schools on the one hand and the scientific community on the other. If I were Jimmy the Greek, guess who I would bet on there? You don't stop science. So we need governments and others to start thinking now about how you deal with these, the consequences of what I would call the bio divide. Maybe this is wrong, but I think it's out there, say, 10 years from now, and the AIDS issue is the leading edge of it.
Yes, and then Professor Taylor.
I don't want to keep everybody longer than
I'd like to go back to your comment about NATO. I spent some time with NATO, and I, like you, have good feelings about them, but I wonder if by bringing in former members of the Warsaw Pact, if we're not adding to traditional Russian paranoia, and indeed the paranoia of Belarus and Ukraine and a few other folk.
I'll give you a brief answer, and then at the end I will wave my arms around a little. I think NATO enlargement is very important in a lot of respects, and I won't go on and on, but it is mostly psychological. And I think if you pictured the world now, if there hadn't been NATO enlargement with regard to Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and the other nations that want to become members of NATO, I don't think we would have reinforced democracy the way we did, because democratic institutions are a part of NATO membership. They would be far more anti-Russian than they are now, because they were so scared of the Russians, the Polish government. Many of them tell me this. If you ask yourself, imagine the following. Supposing 15 years from now, some of the current trends in Russia, which are alarming, the nationalism that is sort of compensatory because of their sense, again, of weakness, where in Russian schools now they're starting to study the glories of the Soviet Union again, or Putin's bringing in the Soviet national anthem with different words back again, et cetera, et cetera. Supposing 10 or 15 years from now, Russia has gone south, maybe literally in Georgia, but I mean figuratively. And supposing at that point the Poles and the Czechs and the others were saying, help, here they come again, save us. At that point, if we were to enlarge NATO or throw a security blanket over them, we really would have exacerbated the crisis with Russia, right? And if at that point we didn't do something, we would make Neville Chamberlain look like Winston Churchill. So I think it behooves us to be doing this now in the way we're doing it, and we need to understand this. We are not saying let's do a new expanded dividing line between NATO and Russia and some others. We are saying when anybody meets the criteria for membership, then they may become members, and that includes, and this is not going to happen in a generation, possibly two, that includes Russia at some point. I think a lot of yes, it's exacerbated some of the problems in nationalism in Russia, but much less than the opponents of NATO enlargement had said. For example, they were saying that NATO enlargement was going to create a backlash that would destroy Yeltsin in the election, and in fact, polls showed that it played no role at all with the Russian electorate. It does with some of the elites. Now my rant. So I think it's a good idea strategically, is the bottom line. what you hear now and what the Russians are starting to say is, okay, but make a distinction between the former members of the Warsaw Pact and the former members of the Soviet Union, i.e., okay, Poles, Hungarians, etc., but no to the Baltics, no to Ukraine, etc. And I would say that that is, A, if we ever agreed to it, and if we don't talk the Russians out of that position, bad policy, because then we would have been changing it from anybody who meets criteria can come in to making geopolitical judgments that the Russians would begin to resent. But more importantly, the Baltics did not ask to become members of the Soviet Union. And to tell them now that because you were enforcibly incorporated into the Soviet Union, therefore you may never be a member of NATO is the worst case of double jeopardy and just a moral abomination. There, I wave my arms about it. I think it would be wrong.
Professor Taylor and
Dr. Lake, I believe in 1994 you made a speech on national security affairs and you indicated that during the 1970s and 1980s you were basically a skeptic on the viability of all voluntary military forces we have. And then I believe you indicated that you became a convert. Very brief two-part question. First, is there some sort of epiphany you went through to come to that conclusion? And second, do you foresee in the next 20 years the possibility of the United States going back to a draft?
Actually, I may have said that. If I did, I lied, because that's not what I believed at the time. I mean, I think what I said was that the way the all-voluntary force has been managed and the transition that our military made from the late 1980s till the mid-1990s and downsizing was, yes, there were problems, it was close to a managerial miracle, and I applauded that. But I actually have always believed in a draft. How's this for pandering to a college audience? I think all of you ought to be in the sense that I believe we should have universal service, as many nations do, which means not everybody goes into the military, but I think everybody should serve a year or two, whether it's in the Peace Corps or in VISTA or in the military or whatever. Not just because it would be good for the nation, but believe it or not, because I think it would be good for all of you. This is not a message that you traditionally get from older people if you're no damn good and you need to shape up. It's just that I think that you learn a lot and through service.
okay, we have time for only two very short questions. Jensen Bridges and then Professor Gunlix.
I think you were saying and short answers also, so I'll try to be.
Sure.
Okay.
I'll try to be good.
You've touched briefly on state approaches to acts of terror. What role, if any, do you foresee intergovernmental organizations playing in the 21st century as regards acts of terrorism?
How do you mean?
Intergovernmental organizations such as the UN.
Oh, I see. Yeah. I think the UN will play some role, and I believe in the UN and all of that, but I wouldn't put my eggs in that basket on this issue. I think what is needed is not so much one big international police force that can do all of this. And we're starting to see this in specific areas, for example, on money laundering. But what we need, I think what is realistic, is a series of international agreements and regimes through which not only can police forces do a better job of trading information, et cetera, but we can begin to address what is an extremely thorny issue. And that is, how do you, it's easier on crime than on terrorism in some ways, how do you harmonize to some degree domestic legal regimes that allow us to act on a somewhat more common basis in dealing with these threats, for example, on money laundering. Now, this sounds like, yeah, that's a good idea, but the fact is that we live, and happily so, in the freest society just about on earth. And therefore, if we are going to be dealing with some of these issues in some of the ways that others do, we are going to get all the more into a very difficult debate about to what degree are we willing to give up our individual freedoms for the sake of combating terrorists. Let me use just very briefly one specific example, and maybe you all can wrestle with this over the next few days, because to me there's no obvious answer. Under our anti-terrorism legislation, which I think was good legislation, if you are arrested for suspected terrorism or terrorist ties. When you go to court, you are not, under our laws now, perhaps going to be presented with the evidence against you, which is profoundly un-American. So you're all thinking, yeah, we shouldn't be doing that. But there is a practical problem here, which is that if you arrest a member of a terrorist organization and you haven't arrested other members of the terrorist organization, if you present the evidence to the one, then immediately the others will know how you're going after that organization, whether or not you know who the other members are, et cetera, and then human lives could be lost. This is what you call a dilemma. My own, now the judge sees the evidence, and the judge can sort of decide for the defendant in these cases what's fair or not. My own view is, and again this is a real dilemma, that the burden of proof ought to be on those who would take away the civil liberties rather than on those who would defend them. And so the government damn well ought to prove that there is an overwhelming reason that this evidence shouldn't be presented to the defendant, because, as I said, otherwise we have made a fundamental change in our own laws. It's the kind of issue that we have to deal with. And I wish all of you in your generation luck with wrestling with them over the next 30 years or so.
Professor Gonix, this is the last question.
You said that you would not talk about peacekeeping.
No, I said I would if anybody asked.
But I'm going to ask you about peacekeeping. And if you would also comment on the so-called Powell Doctrine, and whether you think that Powell will actually be able to conform to that doctrine.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I'm going to say is somewhat similar to what I think the Powell Doctrine actually is, because I think it's been caricatured. And by the way, I'm an admirer of his, and I hope he prevails in the arguments that are now going on in Washington, because he is more pragmatic than I think some of the others. The short version of this is that I think when you are sending, as on almost any issue, but when you're sending young American men and women into a military adventure operation, whether it's a conventional conflict or a peacekeeping operation or whatever, you need to set a very clear political objective for what they are doing, because otherwise you don't have an exit strategy in what I think is the real meaning of an exit strategy, which is not what do you do if you're losing. I think the real problem here is how do you know when you've succeeded so that you can leave? You see what I mean? That was the problem in Vietnam, that almost by definition, the only success that we could achieve would be leaving behind a government in Saigon that could survive on its own. And the more we did, the more we undercut that government's nationalist credentials, the worse trouble it was in, the more it needed us, et cetera. Therefore, our military did not lose in Vietnam. What happened was our military, because they didn't, they were never defeated militarily, what happened was our military was never able to achieve a clear political objective that in my view was unattainable. It took me only 8 years of working on this issue to figure that out, and I was not alone, tragically. So I think in peacekeeping operations now, we need to be more precise on what it is that we are trying to achieve. And my criticism, I was a hawk on Kosovo. I think we should have not taken ground troops off the table for diplomatic reasons. I think we should be very involved now, doing more in Macedonia to try to head off a new crisis there, et cetera. But I am critical of Kosovo in the sense that we did not come to terms with, and I don't think any of us could say, what is our political objective there. We've never said. Is it autonomy for Kosovo? Is it independence for Kosovo? Is it Serbian sovereignty over Kosovo? What is it? And the danger is that if you simply go in because you can't stand the pain anymore without having thought through what it is that you're trying to accomplish, then you can be there forever. And if we keep doing that around the world, if we do it, if the UN does it, et cetera, simply intervening when there is a conflict without knowing how you're going to get out again, the UN is going to become the greatest colonial power in history, and it's going to become politically unsustainable. And the reaction here in our military and politically in the United States is going to be against peacekeeping, which would be a tragedy because we need to be doing it. Now that begs the question of, so what kind of political objective are you talking about? And very briefly, and this is heresy, we are on autopilot in saying we always have to go in to save societies from fracturing. I think that may be unattainable in some cases. The presumption ought to be, and I hope we stick with this at least sometime longer in Bosnia, yes, let's try to hold them together. But there may be cases, as I would say in Kosovo, where that is, I think, almost certainly unattainable, and for reasons of history and recent bloodshed and all of that. And therefore, we ought to be saying, okay, let's look at a high degree of autonomy or something. I won't say what it is. And there may be cases, as in East Timor, where we simply have to go in and say, okay, no mas, and preside over a peaceful separation. Again, that should be only in some circumstances. We ought to have a very clear set of questions that we ask about when that is. What are the regional effects? Are we going to create a new minority that will then be abused by the new majority, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? But we ought to have it on the table, because otherwise I think we're going to keep lurching into these situations where they can't hold together. Just a final point, because I think it's an interesting way to visualize it. Imagine that there was a map of the world up here. And this is why I think there's going to be more and more of these cases. The first map is the map that we all see, which is the map of states.
Color-coded.
Yeah, and of states. And it's real. Those are real governments. Second map would be a map of what you could call nations, i.e. groups of people who define themselves not in the terms of that state, but in terms of their own nation. And if you look at that map, the map of the Middle East, Africa, Canada, a lot of places are very different, and that's why there's these pushes. And the third very real map is the map, is a real economic map, and of real economic units. So for example, Taiwan is a part of a map that would include Eastern China, parts of India, Hong Kong, the Silicon Valley, et cetera. Those units are, seriously, I mean, there's competition with the Silicon Valley for people, goods, et cetera, and symbiosis. So that map is very different. And it is showing smaller, in some senses, smaller and smaller, larger units, but also smaller and smaller units, so that in a way unimaginable 15 years ago, a Kosovo can imagine being independent in a way it couldn't before, because you don't have to be on the ocean anymore to be Singapore. You see what I mean? So I think that these three different maps are the reason why you have all of this global disorder, and why increasingly groups of people are going to believe that they can be independent states in a way that they could never before. And we've got to find ways to adjust our policy in very careful ways to that, or we're going to end up with American-supported blue berets or Americans under blue berets all over the world with no idea of when their missions are going to end.
Okay. Well, we are very grateful to Dr. Lake, who has given us more than 1 hour of very insightful comments and analysis. To show our appreciation, I think we can give him a big applause. We are adjourned. I invite you to use the reception and more opportunity to interact and talk with Dr. Lake.
Could you warn them I have to drive back to Annapolis, so I'm not going to stay?
Yes.
I think this is, I just hope it doesn't have too much consequences, but I think over time we'll see a shift back from as you see
I think they showed what can be done. So, I mean,
Yes, I'm not sure they had another. I'm also doing it for one of my classes.
These are digital and those are confirmation.